If I asked you to name the best Pokemon professor, chances are you'd say Professor Oak. He's the original, he made the Pokédex, he gives you your first starter Pokemon, and he's easily the most recognizable. It's the comfortable answer, right? Professor Oak is the best. It's the easy answer, comfortable answer, and it might just be the wrong answer. Today we're pushing past the nostalgia glasses and the anime fame to figure out who is the best Pokemon professor, who has the greatest mind in Pokemon, not who gives out the best starter Pokemon or who's the most recognizable, but who actually made the biggest impact on the Pokemon world. To do that, we need to set some ground rules as to what makes someone an accomplished Pokemon professor. And to do that, we're going to set up 3 categories. Firstly, we're going to be looking at groundbreaking discoveries. Did they make any huge discoveries that changed the way we understand Pokemon? What did they discover? New evolution mechanics? New ways to use Pokemon? New Pokemon? What did they actually discover? Secondly, we're going to be looking at lasting impact. They may have discovered something amazing, but did it actually last? Did it make a big impact? Was it actually something that the Pokemon world used going forward, or was it just a one-time thing and then it disappeared? And lastly, we're going to be looking at foundational contributions. Not just the flashy stuff, but how have they contributed to how people understand Pokemon in the first place? From first principles going forward, how do people understand Pokemon better because of these professors? With that in mind, it means that creating the first electronic Pokédex might not be a home run win for Professor Oak, because other professors have done things in these areas that may outshine him, which means the answer is not just a one and done. So let's get down a little bit deeper and speak about what every professor does and how they rank in these 3 areas. And to do that, we're going to split the professors up into some categories as well, based on what research they are doing. To start off with, we're going to talk about the specialists and the ones that talk about regional phenomena. These are people that have done specialized research into one type of Pokemon mechanic and become the authority in that. To start off, we're going to be talking about Professor Magnolia and her Dynamax research, because that had a huge impact on Galar. Not only did she actually stabilize the Dynamax mechanic, because before it was just something that happened, she created the Dynamax band from the Wishing Stars that allowed people to actually control Dynamax, albeit in specific locations, and also power Galar's energy. She did an incredible job at actually creating the Dynamax mechanic and actually stabilizing it, even though her mechanic is locked to Galar, because that's the only place that you have power spots, so you can't actually use it through the rest of the Pokemon world. But next up, we're talking about someone that may have extended himself a little bit further than that, and that's Professor Sycamore and his discovery of Mega Evolution. Now, yes, Mega Evolution was discovered in the Kalos region, but it has not only been used there. It's actually spread to 3 regions. 4 if you include the Let's Go games. That's Kalos, Kanto, Hoenn, and Alola. 4 out of the 9 regions where you can Mega Evolve, and this started with Professor Sycamore's research into how Pokemon can evolve further, unlocking that secret of the Mega Stones, the bonds between trainers, and unlocking a new type of power in Pokemon that spread throughout nearly half the Pokemon world just from his research alone. Finally, for the specialists, we've got 2 Pokemon professors that kinda count as one duo from Alola, Professor Kukui and Professor Burnett. Now, Professor Kukui is doing research into Pokemon moves, and with his research related to the Tapus, it's about Z-moves, the ultimate move power of Pokemon, able to draw out everything that a Pokemon has. Obviously, this is related to the Tapus, needs a Z Power Crystal that is blessed by the Tapus, so getting one if you're not in Alola is difficult, but it can still be used outside of Alola, as we saw in the Masters 8 tournament. So, Professor Kukui's research is based on Z moves. What about Professor Burnett? She's been researching Ultra Wormholes and the Ultra Beasts, Pokemon that come from dimensions other than ours. So she's been looking at Pokemon that we don't even have access to in the normal world. Together, these 2 are researching not only what Pokemon moves can do, but where Pokemon come from in other dimensions. So they are specialists in their crafts, but their research might not yet be applicable all over. Next, we're going to talk about the boundary pushers, and for this, we only have 1 generation's professors to talk about, that being Professors Sada and Turo, counterparts in Scarlet and Violet. They are the ones that pushed the scientific boundaries so far that they actually created a time machine to bring in Pokemon from past and future timelines different to our own. It has been confirmed that the Paradox Pokemon may not be from the Pokemon timeline that we know, but from branching past and future timelines where Pokemon similar to the ones that we have now exist in different forms. However, Sada and Turo didn't really have any concern for what had happened to the ecological balance of the world when they did this research, so they brought in these Pokemon knowing that it could actually ruin the ecological balance of Paldea and the world in general. They weren't really worried about that though. In the end, there was only an AI of them left to be able to tell you what was happening and to be able to ask you to stop it. So their plans, while ambitious, weren't exactly good for the rest of the Pokemon world. Although I must admit, I do love Paradox Pokemon, but that's not what this is about. Second to last, we're going to be talking about the Foundationalists. These are Pokemon professors that are not looking into anything flashy. They're not bringing Pokemon in from other timelines. They're not looking at new evolution or move mechanics like Dynamax, Z-moves, or Mega Evolution. But they're doing solid research that actually has a scientific impact in the Pokemon world. We don't need to look any further than Professor Birch to understand how important this is. Professor Birch is studying Pokemon habitats, so he's not someone you'll find in his lab looking at a machine, he's out doing field work. The first time we meet him, he's being chased by a Poochyena that he got a little bit too close to while he was trying to study it. He may not be the one publishing the most out there theories or advancing new mechanics, but he's the one that makes sure that people understand how people and Pokemon work together, how the Pokemon biology and habitats work, and how we can maintain those habitats. In fact, in the Gen 3 remake games, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, his work on Pokemon habitats even expands after the primal Pokemon is calmed, because the energy released by that primal Pokemon changes the Pokemon habitats and makes Hoenn more hospitable to other Pokemon. So his work into Pokemon habitats directly ties into the story of the game he's in. Next we have Professor Rowan. Professor Rowan is focused on Pokemon evolution, looking at the energy of Pokemon evolution, and the thing is, everyone knows about Pokemon evolution, right? Everyone knows Pokemon evolve, but Professor Rowan was the first one to say that a lot of Pokemon, almost 90%, may share common ancestry, and that ties directly into Sinnoh's myths with Arceus, Palkia, Giratina, and Dialga. And lastly in this category, but not least at all, we have Professor Juniper of Unova. First female professor that we had in Pokemon, but also one of the most important, because she was looking into the origin of Pokemon themselves. When Rowan studied how they change, Professor Juniper asked, where did they come from? How did their biology start off? How did the story of Pokemon start? Where did Pokemon themselves come from? And to understand that would be a huge step in understanding Pokemon themselves. So again, these three are not doing any research that will make you stand up and say, wow, that's going to totally change how I play my battles and change how I do things in the Pokemon world, but it does give you an understanding of what's actually happening in the Pokemon world, which is, you know, pretty impressive. But lastly, we have the true titans, the ones that have actually changed immense things. The game changers themselves. The professor whose discoveries didn't just add to our knowledge, they wrote the book on it themselves. The top contenders for the most influential and accomplished professors. First of all, we've got one that you may not be thinking of. Professor Elm from the Johto region. Professor Elm's research was into breeding. He was the first one to realize and to prove that Pokemon breeding happened via eggs. Up until then, no one actually knew how Pokemon breeding worked. And if you've ever done the Masuda method, or you've ever tried to hatch for a specific nature of Pokemon, or specific egg moves, you have Professor Elm's research to thank for that. And Ditto has him to thank for not just being a gimmick Pokemon that you're catching to complete your Pokedex. Although in actual fact I don't quite know how Ditto feels about Professor Elm, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that he discovered that. In all honesty, I don't really want to know what Ditto thinks, because either way, it's gonna be disturbing. So we're moving on. Next, we have to go back to a recently introduced region, but probably the oldest of them all, the ancient land of Hisui, and probably the most underappreciated Pokemon professor of all, Professor Laventon. To a lot of people, he just looks like a bumbling, ridiculous old man, but come on, he had nothing to work with. In his time, Pokemon were feared as, evil, ferocious creatures, and no one really knew anything about them until he started studying them. There was no science for him to go off of. He had to invent it as he went along. He used the recently invented Pokeball capture mechanic to study, capture, and then study again Pokemon. He used that to create not a fancy high-tech Pokedex, but one he created by hand as he was studying these Pokemon close up. Some of his observations were obviously proven to be wrong in future generations, but he was the one that made these observations and started the idea of Pokemon science. He started the studying of Pokemon science. And to that's kind of a great contribution, because if it wasn't for him, there may not have been any Pokemon science for the others to work off of. And lastly, we come back to the man himself, the most well-known, Professor Samuel Oak. He created the electronic Pokedex. He revolutionized the way to actually understand Pokemon by mass-producing a Pokedex that trainers could go out, use, and actually understand all the Pokemon they came into contact with. But that wasn't all he did. He actually created the system where Pokemon trainers go on journeys to complete that Pokedex. He started off the modern system of Pokemon being friends, partners, and part of people's lives. That was Professor Oak's contribution. He made that mainstream throughout the entire world. From something that Professor Laventon started, Professor Oak's kind of perfected it. He brought Pokemon into people's lives in a way that had not been popularized before. Laventon had tried, Oak was the one that perfected it. So, after all that, who is the most accomplished Pokemon professor? The specialists like Magnolia, Sycamore, Kukui, they're revolutionary, but they're not affecting the entire world. It's largely situated where they are. There's no greater impact beyond that. The boundary pushers like Sada and Tudo, they achieved the impossible, but it came at a high cost and would have destroyed the world if they'd actually gotten their way. Then there are the foundationalists like Birch, Rowan, and Juniper. They're the ones that are making it easier to understand Pokemon in the everyday world for everyone else, and they are doing solid work on their own. But it comes down to the groundbreakers, the big three: Elm, Oak, and Laventon. Professor Elm's discovery of Pokemon eggs was a biological revolution. It answered one of the most fundamental questions about life in the Pokemon world, and it made a new way to get viable Pokemon in competitive battling, both in-game and, meta for us in the real world. Professor Oak was the popularizer. He took the idea of Pokedex research, made it mainstream, and made people able to understand Pokemon all over the world. But if we look at our criteria, groundbreaking discovery, lasting impact, foundational contributions, there's only one winner here. The most accomplished Pokemon professor is Professor Laventon. And here's why. He started with nothing. He walked into a world where Pokemon were feared. People didn't know what they were. They were just these, scary creatures that would attack people without any provocation. And he was the one that started researching them. In this world where no one knew anything about Pokemon, and probably only one person, aka the player character, was able to gather Pokemon for him to study, he still walked out there, went to study Pokemon, and recorded his findings in a Pokedex, starting off that process for people to live around Pokemon. He didn't just make a discovery. He figured out how to discover things about Pokemon. He studied them with no prior knowledge. He created the template that's been used ever since then, meaning he was the foundational Pokemon professor. He was the one that had the greatest impact, and he is, in fact, the most accomplished Pokemon professor of all. But that's just my take. This is obviously a debate, plenty of good arguments, you may disagree with me. Who do you think is the most accomplished Pokemon professor? Is it Professor Laventon, the one who created the Pokemon study system? Is it Professor Oak, the one who actually perfected it? Is it Professor Elm, who made breeding a thing? Is it one of the Pokemon professors that discovered the new mechanics like Mega Evolution, Dynamax, or Z-moves? What do you think? Who do you think the most accomplished Pokemon professor is? Let me know down below in the comments what you think, and I'll see you next time, everyone. Bye.